Ciao everyone and welcome to this festive episode of Voices of Italy dedicated to Easter, or in Italian Pasqua, as this episode is going out right on this year's Easter day. And while some Italians will be heading to church and others straight to barbecuing and eating colomba, you and I will be together and talking about how does Easter really look like in today's Italy? Is it still rooted in religion, or is it just all about chocolate eggs? In this episode, we crack open Italy's modern Easter traditions, food, and some personal memories too. Buona Pasqua and welcome to episode number 12. Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia.
Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. So, since we're dropping an episode on Easter Day, Pasqua, I figured why not just taking a little detour of what Easter is. I'm not talking about chocolate eggs just yet, just the origin of it and how it looks like today in Italy. And I was pretty accurate because in addition to my usual research and digging in my personal experience, I even talked to my mom and made sure of what she was doing today before recording this episode. So this is an extra accurate episode of Voices of Italy. So Easter is actually the most important Christian holiday, yes, even more than Christmas, even if Christmas is prettier, according to my opinion. And Easter celebrates the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Over time, it has become basically a day off and a cultural moment for most Italians, even for people that, of course, don't set foot in a church ever. So it's really just one of those main holidays in Italy. This period is traditionally marked by a series of religious commemorations and officially begins with Palm Sunday, called Domenica delle Palme in Italian, and then culminating in Easter Sunday, exactly a week after. As you probably know, Easter is always on a Sunday and is not always on the same day every year. And if you have ever wondered why Easter just jumps around the calendar every year, it's because it follows the lunar calendar. So not the one that we use every day today, but it falls on the first Sunday following the first full moon or after the spring equinox. That's why one year is in March, the next is in late April, and people are not always sure exactly until they see it on the calendar. And then right after Easter Sunday, you have Easter Monday, which is officially called in Italy Lunedì dell'Angelo, the Angel Monday, but people commonly just call it Pasquetta, which is a word that kind of means little Easter. And yeah, it's the Monday after Easter Sunday. It's a public holiday in Italy as well. And the name refers to the gospel story of the angel appearing to the women at Jesus's tomb. Most Italians today, though, associate it with just Pasquetta. It's a day that has to do not much with religion, but more with a lazy spring day. It's a time for picnics, outdoor trips, barbecues with friends and families, or seaside escapes sometimes. But in general, it's just a very chill, family and friends focused day rather than a formal holiday of any kind. And when it comes to the religious celebrations for Pasqua, in general, they can vary across regions, and there are even towns with their own specific, really local traditions. Obviously, one of the most solemn events is the Via Crucis that happens on Good Friday, and the processions sort of reenact the stations of the cross. In Rome, in particular, the Pope leads this long procession at the Colosseum, and this is obviously one of those bigger, most popular events attracting thousands of pilgrims and also common tourists every year. But a really popular one is also the one that happens every year in Florence. The Easter morning rituals there include this centuries old tradition known as Scoppio del Carro, which means explosion of the cart. And it's this towering firework field cart called Brindellone, or whatever they pronounce it like in Florence. And it's pulled by oxen through the streets of the city and arriving to the Duomo. And during the Easter Mass, there is this sort of mechanical dove called la colombina that slides down through a wire and gets to the point that it ignites the fireworks inside the cart. So there is this huge explosion that is believed to bring good luck. So it's part of a sacred ritual, but clearly doesn't really have 100% to do with the church, it's coming from popular traditions. Where I come from in Sicily, there's another completely different tradition that for me, it's always been the Easter tradition, but it's actually quite local. There are similar celebrations done in other parts of Sicily and in the south of Italy. But in my town, for example, this tradition is celebrated with its own name and its own modalities. The name is Sguondru, which is a Sicilian phrase that means the meeting, l'incontro, for my Italian listeners that cannot understand Sicilian. And Sguondru is this event that is sort of a reenactment again, but in this case of the encounter between the resurrected Christ and his mother Mary. There are these two big statues representing one Jesus and the other for Mary that are carried out by people through the streets until they meet in one of the squares at the center of the town, which symbolizes the joy of the resurrection through this meeting. You know, the two statues for a while they go back and forth because the celebration is accompanied by music, cheer. There's even a moment where some doves are released, so the statues kind of dance for a while before the final meeting when they start coming back. And there is this really vibrant and emotional atmosphere. There's an obvious religious meaning for people, but at the same time, I think people perceive it like really my tradition, my local tradition, something deep rooted with your cultural heritage, as much as the religious one, at least, if not more. But even though these kind of rituals are still very important and a big part of Italian Easter celebrations, the overall picture doesn't really mean that Italians are super devoted and that things haven't really changed from that point of view. On the contrary, again, people see all this a lot of times as part of their cultural heritage more than their religious identity. On the contrary, there are multiple surveys and studies that actually show sort of a decline in religious practice in general in Italy. But in the case of Easter, it just remains very significant from a cultural point of view. And it's just essentially another excuse to feast and pause your diet for a few days. So this is when we start talking about food, because I know that you want to hear about Pasqua, typical Pasqua food. There's here too, it's difficult to talk about typical Pasqua food without going local. It really changes from, if you don't want to really say that every region has really its own unique things, because sometimes actually they're quite resembling of each other, but definitely you can see in the map areas at least split usually into three areas: north, center, and south. And usually traditions including food are really localized at least in those three macro parts, and this is the case as well. For example, something that is popular popular during Easter in North Italy is something called torta pasqualina. Is this savory pie made with spinach, ricotta, cheese, and eggs. And it's sort of symbolize the rebirth and spring. Some of you that maybe follow me on Instagram and Facebook might have seen that I gave myself a little bit of torta pasqualina this week in the spirit of Easter. I actually got it this time at my favorite pastry shop here in Torino, and it was really, really good. If you have a chance to eat that, you definitely should, because not only it's really good, but it's also quite old of a recipe. It dates back to the 16th century. And there's this sort of legend that women from Genova sort of challenged themselves to make a torta pasqualina that had up to 33 layers of pastry to symbolize each year of Jesus Christ's life. So there's actually also a cool backstory. But then if you move south in Naples, for example, the quintessential dish is pastiera, which is typically common actually in general in the whole Campania region during Easter. And the modern version of this one is sort of a sweet tart made of ricotta, wheat, orange blossom water, and candied fruits. And it was probably invented in a Neapolitan convent in the 17th century, but the actual origin might be even older. It probably dates back to those more pagan traditions of spring and offering food to the gods kind of thing. And there's actually one story that connects the pastiera to the siren Parthenope. The Neapolitans thanked her for her sweet singing by giving her ricotta, flour, eggs, milk, spices, and sugar. So Parthenope gave those ingredients to the gods, and the gods made pastiera out of it. So one of those things that when people wonder why Italians are so obsessed with food, just look at our history. Everything is like blessing food and treating food in this godly way. So that's why. And then if you move even further down in Sicily, there's the legendary pane con l'ova. It just means bread with eggs. And it's basically the most common Easter related food. It's a sweet breaded bread baked with sort of ornamental hard-boiled eggs. And actually, it kind of looks like most of the time like this flat 2D bread basket with a boiled egg in the middle. And in some areas of Sicily, just baked as a sweet bread. In other areas, for example, where I come from, it's just bread sometimes, so savory. In other areas, it's even fried. The general concept remains the same. So yeah, each region has its own twists on the Easter foods, usually related to eggs, but it really shows how different parts of Italy really celebrate everything with their own unique way. Even though, again, you can see patterns, you can see like macro groups. And sometimes if you think about that, you realize that the traditional food, like really those recipes that are really much older, they are quite different from the kind of food that we actually eat today, like as in really modern food that you eat in this case during Easter, because chocolate rabbits and chocolate eggs are really the most common food that you today associate to Easter, especially if you celebrate with and around kids. Like there's chocolate everywhere. And those of course have nothing to do with all the Easter in terms of traditional Christian celebrations, and of course with Christianity taking over everything, that those symbols were also absorbed from traditions to really Christian rituals. Today, the rabbit, even in Italy, is a big symbol of Easter, but it's not really clear why it has been associated with Christianity in terms of holidays, especially because the Gospels really have no trace of rabbits anywhere. It's just a symbol that is not there religiously. And it was just adopted as a symbol by the first Christian communities, and maybe because it was considered a symbol of fertility in ancient times, and therefore it was linked to the arrival of spring, and all the holidays connected to it. Since Easter is traditionally celebrated between March and April, at a certain point the rabbit was adopted as a Easter symbol. And when it comes to the other main one that I was mentioning, chocolate eggs, it's a big deal in Italy. It's a big symbol of just modern Easter. Religiously speaking, originally the eggs start coming into play because during Easter, the first Christians used to paint eggs red and decorate them with like crosses and other symbols. And it's a tradition that in some other types of Christian communities still continues, but symbolically it all has to do with the egg being the symbol of life. So it started to be associated with the rebirth of Jesus and therefore with Easter. And according to some studies, the tradition of Easter eggs was really strengthened by all the indications related to the Lent, which is the period of 40 days before Easter, in which Catholics are invited to penance and a few days of fasting. So if you want to hear a little more about the traditions related to that period of the year, you can find some more on episode number 6 of Voices of Italy, that it was about the Carnevale traditions associated with the Lent. But during this period, eating meat is forbidden. Initially, it was also forbidden to eat eggs. The problem is that it was really difficult to force chickens not to lay eggs. And so they suddenly started to have this need to do something with the surplus of eggs that could not be eaten during that time. So there started the tradition of boiling them until they became hard, and then they could paint them with obviously religious symbols. The chocolate came a lot later. We're talking about 18th century France and Germany, but it wasn't until the 19th century that obviously with the Industrial Revolution, the chocolate production as we know it today sort of started. So they started to spread across Europe, especially because of the technological progress. So even if we started elsewhere, Italians definitely took that chocolate egg idea and ran with it. And we actually made it into something huge, at least in the sense of how much of a big part of Easter celebration it is today. There's no Easter without chocolate eggs. And something that I didn't even know about before preparing for today's episode is that actually this tradition begun right here in Torino. And for some of those that might not realize it, this city, I think I'm starting to think it's really overshadowed by places like Rome and Florence. There's this thing that people from Turin sort of complain about, that it gets overshadowed by Milan and that we should market Turin a little more like Milan. Well, whatever the reason, I'm realizing that I tend to mention Turin a lot when I mention historical or at least contemporary history about Italy. And yeah, I realized it's a much more important city than I think us Italians even realize. But okay, coming back to chocolate eggs. Apparently, the first chocolate eggs in Italy were created here in Torino in the late 1700s. And it's thanks to some of Turin's most famous chocolate makers that this tradition then later took off in general. So not only this city is the home of Gianduiotto, which inspired Nutella. You can hear a little more about this story in episode 2 of Voices of Italy, but it also opened the way for Easter chocolate eggs in Italy. So that's pretty cool. I actually read this very interesting article this week in the local edition of Corriere della Sera, which is one of the major Italian newspapers, about how the chocolate egg, as we know it it today was born right here. And in 1725, the first chocolate eggs became to be produced right here in Turin. According to the article, apparently, after some unsuccessful experiments in France, it was a woman from here that was known as Vedova Giambone, which means the Giambone we know, in her small little workshop on a street that today is one of the most important streets here in the city center. It's called Via Roma. And Vedova Giambone is known as the one that had the idea of filling the empty shells of chicken eggs with melted chocolates. The city here is actually very proud of that fact. But later on, in the 1920s, Casa Sartorio, which was a renewed confectionery company from here in Torino, was the company that actually patented for the first time a method for molding hollow chocolate shapes, but essentially they managed to ensure that the chocolate paste spread uniformly across the mold's interiors. Casa Sartorio also introduced the concept of placing like a little surprise inside these chocolate eggs. Usually they were sugar animals or sugared almonds, but it became just a common thing to do, placing something inside the eggs, especially for children. So in the 20s, all those elements became really just a must-have, something really common. And it's a tradition that really today it's super important. Again, especially it's a cute novelty for kids, and it becomes just a national obsession. Every grocery store is full of a million types and brands of eggs. They're really everywhere. And on the one hand, you can say that it's a tradition that it's really a capitalistic one, but at the same time, the chocolate eggs traditions, it's really considered one of those Italian food related excellencies. And, you know, all the big famous pastry chefs or chocolate chefs really compete, and they are obviously more talked about in this time of the year because of the super creative, crafty eggs that they make. And they are very precious also in price, especially due to the recent increase of price in the raw materials. And they can get up to 100 euros even for an egg. I think about someone really famous like Eugenio Massari. Those are the prices that we're talking about. And even for more industrialized kind of eggs, when they are branded, they can cost even anywhere between 20 and 60 euros per egg. Italy's chocolate egg market is really huge, and it's worth something like 200 millions every year. So the industry continues to grow, and even the new artisanal variations, limited editions collections, they just add on the market even more. When I personally think about my connection with Easter, I mean, all my knowledge and experience of Easter celebration come from my childhood because I was raised as a Catholic, and I was participating in some of the religious activities that I was mentioning before, Domenica delle Palme, the Easter Day Mass, which is something that I just don't practice anymore, that I don't do anymore, even though I remember it kind of fondly. When I was a kid, it was a day where, you know, usually during the spring. So being in Sicily in the spring is just lovely. It's the best time of the year. Temperature's so nice. It's sunny. And, you know, so there are lots of outdoor activities, and even the religious ones, or you don't just stay inside the church for the usual mass. There's other processions and other celebrations that are done outdoors. So I think it's also nice for kids. It becomes like a second Carnevale part two, sort of. And in particular, I remember as a kid too that I used to like Domenica delle Palme, the Palm Sunday, where people actually carry palm leaves. Sometimes they're even all decorated with just little cute colorful ornaments and carried during the religious procession. I don't know, when I was a kid it was just fun to do, I guess. But it was also a family holiday with extended family gatherings, probably because I think Italians usually spend the main holiday of the year So Christmas with really the closest family members, and those already the closer family gatherings that I'm referring to might already be kind of big for the average foreigners slash Americans listening here. The close circle of family can be already kind of big, but usually, it's you, your parents, siblings, grandparents from both sides of your parents. And then, depending on how many siblings your parents have, they could also be there, unless they have their own extended in law family gatherings that they need to attend. For Pasqua, maybe those groups that are not necessarily together, then they get together in this occasion. But yeah, in general, there's a lot of family time. I think Pasqua also is more tied to its religious meaning than Christmas, at least in the habits of most people. Again, in my experience, I used to like it as a kid, but it was just part of my life. It was something that everybody in a small town like mine were just doing, regardless of how much they actually believed in the religious side of the tradition. And the Sguondru part, for example, that I was mentioning before, again, is clearly religious, but at the same time, people really have fun. People are really excited about meeting all together in town. And to be honest, when I got a little older, in my teenage years, I kind of started to like it a little less at that point, because another aspect of that celebration, at least in a small southern Italy town like mine, it's really that celebration is really one of the opportunities that people have, again, to get together and do something a little different than usual. And people have this habit to really dress up a lot. That's something that I was never a big fan of. When I was a teenager, I was really shy and I was a lot into metal music and dark clothes. So it was really not my vibe at all. And, the whole town was gathered there. Everybody knows everybody. And everybody is like basically competing for who has especially the girls, for who has the best outfit. And there's all the gossip, the extra dressing up, walking around a lot. And my town is on a hill, so it's really, really tiring. Anyway, teenager me really didn't like it. But now as an adult, I really find that tradition quite cool, quite fascinating. And I think he speaks a lot about where I come from. And I realized that my feelings when I was younger were very much affected by my life there, by the small town kind of lifestyle that today, again, doesn't affect me anymore. So I definitely think about it more fondly. I think it happens to a lot of Italians, especially millennials. We have this kind of conflicted relationship with our traditions and our modern lifestyle. And I think we managed to kind of balance those two at this point. We're not too much like our parents, and we're not totally don't know anything about it like Gen Z. I don't know. I don't hang out with a lot of Gen Z, so maybe I'm not very accurate. Also, I really have honestly beautiful memories about Pasqua in my childhood, especially with my dad. It was one of those rare occasions that I get to spend more time with him and go around town with him, because my mom usually in Easter Day would just stay behind at home and be too busy with starting to cooking lunch. I know this memory screams cliche, but it's actually one of the true ones. I actually meant it before recording this episode. I called my mom just to say Happy Easter and check on each other. My mom literally told me that she started to cook at 8 a.m. today. And when I called her, it was around 10 a.m., I think. And she was, halfway there. Some of the food was already ready, some of the food wasn't there yet. And they're celebrating today with some of their siblings. So obviously she has to make some good food since it's a celebration. And also another cool thing about Pasqua is that you usually get kind of prolonged fun because there's like part 1 and part 2, because as I was saying before, after the Easter Sunday, the following Monday is a national holiday and it's called commonly Pasquetta, like Little Easter kind of connotation. And for many people, especially young people, it's the best part of the Easter break because it's all about packing a picnic, heading outside for some outdoor activities, barbecuing, depending on, who among your friends has the best countryside place to go and barbecue at. Sometimes it just becomes an excuse for a road trip or just lounging somewhere in the grass in a park with some leftovers from the previous day. So the plan is usually wake up at whatever time you want, check the weather, text your group to figure out who's bringing what and where we're going, and then we go. So this is the expectation. That's why there's this running joke usually in Italy that it always rains in Pasquetta, which is the one day in the year where it shouldn't rain because the general expectation is to go out and celebrate outdoor, very springy activities. So if it rains, it's usually considered very, very lame. So definitely Pasqua today in Italy, it's a mix of traditions, spirituality, culture, and different cultural heritage depending on where you look at. But definitely it's really, really present, really one of those bigger holidays during the year. Again, depends also how religious you are, or if one of your friends has a really cool villa that you want any excuse to go and celebrate at. So this is all for today's episode. Tell me everything about how you celebrate Easter where you are. Let me know on Instagram. You can DM me there at Voices of Italy. And remember to follow the podcast and leave a 5-star review if you like my content. It's incredibly helpful. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.